And welcome to this week's edition of Conversations. I'm Jeff DeForest. We had a great time with you last week as we were talking with boxing savant Randy Gordon, the former commissioner of the New York State Athletic Commission, going into the Boxing Hall of Fame. And surprisingly, late in the show, joined by gentleman Jerry Cooney, who was just a delight. So we had a lot of fun there. And this figures to be much more of the same. As we welcome to the program our special guest this week, and it seems odd that I would have done 50 years of broadcasting various formats, national TV, radio, locally down here for 44 years in South Florida, major radio stations, TV stations. And yet I'm a very reluctant public speaker. So I'm asked to do a favor. They must have run out of anybody of any celebrity stature whatsoever. And my friend Special K, Kevin Heller, big basketball aficionado, says, hey, can you MC this basketball luncheon we do every year? And he had invited me many, many years to come. I never made it. And I always thought, well, geez, they have a lot of basketball dignitaries. I love the game. So it'd be a lot of fun to get out there. And I owed them a few favors for bringing me some guests. And I finally consented to do it, reluctantly so. And then the day comes up and I'm thinking, man, I wish I hadn't volunteered for this. And I get up and I'm looking around the crowd and I'm starting to break into a small flop sweat and thinking, I just have to get through this. Just don't fuck this up for the other people that are here today. Just do your thing, read the scripts. And what happened was, as reluctant as I was to go, it became one of the most compelling events that I've attended, largely due to the great speakers that they had, who all seemed to intertwine stories about how the game of basketball. I'll never forget this. Pat Riley said this to me in an interview one time. I was kind of making some facetious remark about the WNBA with the We Got Next campaign. And Riley, who, I have nothing but respect for, he's on my untouchable All Elliott Ness team of guys. You cannot knock Pat Riley to me ever. And he says to me, you know what, DeForest? It's all about the game, the game itself. And what really emerged from this luncheon, what was the idea that the game, almost in like a Seabiscuit type of theme, helped heal and change a lot of people's lives, and in somewhat improbable fashions. And one of the most compelling stories that I heard was a story about Ernie Grunfeld, and it was depicted and commemorated very, very well in a book by this gentleman. We welcome to the show Ernie Grunfeld's son, Dan Grunfeld, who has quite a list of basketball distinctions of his own, including being a standout in high school and all Pac-10 player at Stanford, had a great career in Europe as well, Maccabee Games gold medal winner, and wrote a book by the grace of the game. And it was so interesting to hear him tell this story that I've wanted to have him on the show ever since. And so we welcome to the program Dan Grunfeld. Dan, so much for joining us here on the program. Thanks so much for joining us on the program. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Jeff, thanks so much for having me, man. I'm excited to be here.
All right. I mean, there's some parallels. I guess, this was really moving for me, especially when you were speaking. And of course, Jack Twyman's son had a great story. Rolando Blackman, who didn't even know what a basketball was when he came here. And a lot of these things emerged from playing street ball in New York, which I wasn't necessarily weaned on city basketball because I didn't really take up basketball myself on any kind of consistent level until I got to Long Island, where we had some great basketball being played. And I always felt, too, getting back to the women, that one of the things that women are missing or were missing at the time growing up in the 50s, they didn't get to play these team sports and form the bonds and learn the life lessons of facing adversity and trying to work in symmetry with people. They kind of missed out on all of that when I was a kid, and it's good to see them participating now. But your story about your dad was fantastic, and it began, and in the subtitle to your book, The Holocaust, A Basketball Legacy, it began in such improbable fashion. Take us back, Dan, to the origins and the origins of the story that you wrote about with your father. And that was the idea that your mother was a Holocaust survivor. And the parallel there, my mother was from the free city of Danzig, which was between Germany and Poland, and just dodged the Holocaust herself because my grandfather got out on like the last boat. So as soon as you started talking about this, I thought, wow, I started thinking about my own mother. Tell us about that and what the story means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my dad, Ernie Grunfeld, is fairly well known in the world of sports, certainly in the world of basketball. But people didn't know prior to my book coming out is that he's the only player in NBA history whose parents are Holocaust survivors. After I did a year and a half of research preparing to write my book, that research suggests he's the only athlete in any major American sports whose parents survived the Holocaust. And so, despite my dad's incredible success as a basketball player and some of the successes that I've had as well, it's my grandmother who's the star of our family and the star of our story. Uh, she turned 99 years old in June, and so she lives in the Bay Area. She's not only my hero, she's also a hero. And yeah, the story really starts with her. So my dad was born in Transylvania on the border of Romania and Hungary. That's where my family is from. And so my grandmother is from a big Orthodox Jewish family of 10 kids, two loving parents. They didn't have electricity, running water, roads, but they had a lot of love and a lot of laughter. And I go to great lengths in my book to kind of describe what life was like before the Holocaust, because we know the numbers, right? 6 million Jews killed, millions more. But these weren't just numbers. They were people. They were the human beings that my grandmother loved more than anyone. And so through some good fortune, some incredible will and smarts. My grandmother survived on the run in Budapest. She was saved twice by Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, but she lost 5 of her siblings and both of her parents in the war.
And they come here, and your dad, Ernie, you also documented this in the book, was kind of bullied and knocked around when he first landed in New York there, and didn't speak English, and a lot changed because of the fact that he somehow made his way into the streets and started playing some New York ball. Tell us about that aspect of the story.
Yeah, 100%. By the way, my grandfather is no longer with us. He was also a survivor. He was in a forced labor camp in Hungary. And so my grandparents, after they came home, got together, started a family. They lived under communism in Romania for a couple decades, which is another, brutal experience. And again, I'm going into depth in that in the book. But it took them 10 years to get visas to leave Romania, to flee communism. And they were initially bound for Israel. And so my dad had an Israeli passport, and they spent 6 months in Rome after leaving Romania. And it was in Rome that they worked with Highest, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and Highest helped them get to the United States. So when you mentioned that Rolando Blackman came to the United States as a youngster from Panama, not knowing what basketball is, that was my dad's background as well. He landed at JFK Airport in 1964, didn't speak a word of English, spoke fluent Hungarian, Romanian, and Italian, had never touched a basketball. But at this point, my family's already living the American dream, right? Because they're in America. They have a chance to work for a living, to speak their minds. For my dad had an older brother. My grandparents had a chance for their boys to get an education. And what my dad called his older brother when they arrived in the United States in their native language, Hungarian, translates to English as "my king." So that's how much my dad kind of worshipped his older brother. My uncle was diagnosed with leukemia a few months after arriving in the United States, and he passed away within a year. So at 17 years old, new immigrants to the United States of America, Holocaust survivors. My grandparents lost their oldest son, and my dad lost his brother. And so, that's a hole that still can't be filled. And I'm very honest about that in my book. I'm named after my uncle. His name was Lutzi in Hungarian, but Leslie in English. And my name is Daniel Leslie Grunfeld, right? So I've always kind of carried that obligation, that responsibility with me. But here my dad was 10 years old, didn't speak the language, was getting picked on, lost his brother. Parents are Holocaust survivors, have to work 6-7 days a week to make a living. So he went to the playgrounds in Forest Hills in Queens, New York to, make friends, learn English, heal from that loss. And he started playing basketball, and it worked out pretty well for him.
Well, he's a New York legend, and everybody loved Ernie Grunfeld. And of course, the story's great, well depicted in the 30 for 30, Bernie and Ernie, the Bernie and Ernie show. And we'll get into that a little bit with his
Sure.
relationship with Bernard King, which you also described very eloquently as well. And it was a nice parallel there at that luncheon because Twyman was talking about, the story with Stokes.
Right.
And his father, Jack Twyman, who was, of course, a legendary NBA player back in the day, and a very, very touching and compelling story. And the Ernie and Bernie story is right there with it because, let's face it, a black guy in Tennessee and a Jew in Tennessee not necessarily seeing the welcome mat that some other, people of different demographics might enjoy.
It's the truth, right? And Bernard, as you mentioned, black man from Brooklyn, New York. My dad is this Jewish immigrant from Queens, New York. They're from the same city, but they're really from different worlds. And
Yes.
they were both great basketball players in high school. They went down to Knoxville. My dad's a year older, so he was all SEC as a freshman, and then the next year he was joined by Bernard, and Bernard was just a shooting star in every sense of the word, right? One of the great players in SEC history, an NBA legend, and my dad and Bernard, they formed one of the greatest duos in college basketball history, as you were talking about, the Ernie and Bernie show, right? And so they each averaged more than 25 points per game the same year, right, as teammates. So
Yeah.
Just this incredible partnership, this incredible story, and to your earlier point about the luncheon that we both attended, how basketball builds bridges, heals wounds on both sides, but also connects people. And in my family, talk about basketball, like the ball, it doesn't care what country you're from, what language you speak, what color your skin is, what religion you are. It just brings you together, right? You compete for the same purpose. You get to know each other, on that court in a really, really deep, intimate way. And so my dad and Bernard are an amazing example of that. And of course, they played together in the NBA later on with the Knicks. And so I grew up with Uncle B, hanging around, and they're still great friends to this day. So it's just an amazing kind of example, like you said, of what the game can do for people.
It's funny too, because you rarely hear when people start talking about the greats of the game, and there are so many, and over the history of basketball since Naismith put up the peach basket. But you don't often hear Bernard King's name mentioned in that category, and yet, I was watching a clip the other night. I guess your father Ernie was not playing in this game when he made his freshman debut, or I don't think freshmen were eligible back then. But when he first played his first varsity game at Tennessee, Bernard King scored 42 points in his first game.
Yeah, he did. Freshmen were eligible then, by the way, and
Okay.
but Bernard, he had 42 his first game as a freshman, and it didn't slow down from there. And by the way, Jeff, you were saying that when you're here in conversations about the greatest of all time, you don't hear Bernard's name. What I'll tell you is my dad must not be in those conversations because it's so cool to hear my dad talk about Bernard as a player and just the incredible respect and admiration. And honestly, it goes both ways. They were both great in college. My dad was a solid NBA player. Bernard was an all NBA player. It was a different level in the NBA, but I know Bernard has great kind of reverence and respect for my dad. But to hear my dad talk about Bernard as a ball player, it's really incredible. And so I know that there are people out there who still talk about Bernard King all the time.
Used to roll through Forest Hills all the time. My family had moved down to Belmore, Long Island, which was on the South Shore there. So, and I had a job as a vendor at Shea Stadium, Dan, and
Nice.
so I used to take the Long Island Railroad, and naturally, Forest Hills was one of the stops. Although we always hoped that it would blow through Forest Hills and be one of those express trains. But as I recall, when you would see the basketball courts, and having played on many New York City courts, and then of course out on Long Island, we had a little bit of an upgrade in terms of the actual physical nature of the courts. That they tended not to have as many potholes.
Right.
You had nets on the basket. But as I remember, I mean, that was some pretty raw stuff. That the conditions to play basketball in any inner city place when you were talking about that particular era.
Yeah, my dad grew up playing at the Austin Street Playground in Forest Hills, Queens, and actually the Long Island Railroad ran right by it. So when he was kind of, when I'm growing up and he's telling me about the park, he always talked about the railroad. He had a friend who unfortunately fell on the tracks and had, was badly injured, but was okay, survived it, but it was very scary. But he always talks about that experience. So yeah, when you were buzzing down on the Long Island Railroad, you might have seen my dad out there, taking some numbers out there on the courts in Forest Hills.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I was already long gone from there by the time
Right.
he was out there in the courts. But nonetheless, I mean, and it was double rims. Did you ever talk about double rims?
Absolutely, and they said
Did
about
you play on double rims too, Dan?
I grew up in northern New Jersey in the suburbs, right? So
Oh, okay.
I
So you had
didn't grow
plexiglass
up
boards in
playing.
the front?
I didn't grow up playing on the playgrounds in that way, but it's not that we didn't have schoolyard playgrounds that I've never played on double rims because I have. But my dad always talks about like his era in particular in New York. You didn't find a lot of shooters, right? Steph Curry wasn't coming out of New York City in
No,
the
you couldn't
70s,
make it.
60s. It's because listen, with the double rims, with the outdoor conditions, you took it to the hole.
Yes.
So there was a lot more kind of close to the basket, figuring out how do I get to the rim? How do I, the physicality and the toughness. But what my dad always says about those days is that, and again, contextualize it that he was a new immigrant. And so he was fighting for, and he lost his brother. So he's fighting for something, a little bit bigger inside of himself. But when you were at the playground and you lost, you'd have to sit for like an hour or two.
Hours, yeah.
And he said, because that's all anyone wanted to do. And the line, there were 50, 100 kids waiting to play. He said, so once you got on, you didn't want to get off. And so I think like the toughness, the determination, that hard-nosed mentality of New York City. And of course, like the Knicks later on in life, when my dad was the general manager of the team, kind of had that same identity. That's what it was all about. That was built at the playground.
I can relate 1,000% because after moving to Long Island, I didn't really get that interested in basketball. Surprisingly, when I lived in Brooklyn, we didn't play a lot of basketball. It was all baseball and hybrid variations of baseball: stoop ball, punch ball, stick ball, box ball, anything we could come up with, curve ball. And then when I got to Long Island, I got more interested in basketball. And I remember as a 16-year-old, we used to go to a park where there were big gatherings of players, high school and college players. And the team that took the court to begin the night was comprised of, this was 3-on-3, Dick McGuire, former coach of the Knicks, who didn't have much respect for even the younger kids when it came to their physicality. I mean, this was the dirtiest player I think I've ever seen in the history of the game. No mercy on anybody. There was a young kid from high school there named Eddie Malloy, who was a very distinguished Long Island basketball player, was an arch rival of the now former coach, Jim Larinaga, knows everything about the guy. And the third guy on their team was Dr. J, a young Dr. J, who used to just stand under the basket and dunk. He wasn't the flamboyant Dr. J that he eventually became. In fact, it would have been very hard to envision this, although he was recognized as a great player. So you can imagine, you went out there, out and got hammered 11-2, no matter who you had on your team. And then you would go down to the other basket, and there would be a guy, a dad playing with like his 6-year-old kid, and you go, hey, can we run with you? And that was it, because you were done for the evening. So I can totally understand that, and there would easily be a way to develop that kind of toughness, which your dad, Ernie Grunfeld, was certainly known for. How did he describe the whole time at the University of Tennessee and the whole, I mean, the adversity that obviously he would have to deal with again, coming back and being somebody that was not necessarily widely accepted?
Yeah, my dad had an incredible experience at Tennessee. I mean, they were a phenomenon, right? Bernard and my dad, they were on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and they were a great team. And so he was, he was in kind of a dream situation, and he says that he was treated fairly, with respect. He loved his time in Knoxville. And now you mentioned the documentary; it's called Bernie and Ernie, the ESPN 30 for 30 that was made about Bernard and my dad. And Bernard is very open about the racism that he experienced in Knoxville, right? And he speaks very honestly and openly about that. My dad's experience was a little bit different in that he didn't feel the anti-Semitism in the same way. And you like to think that basketball is the great equalizer. So on the court, right, it kind of made everything go away, and those guys are just competing and winning and having a great time and being so well respected. But certainly you can't deny kind of the forces of the era and of that geography at the time. So definitely complicated. But yeah, my dad speaks about his time in Knoxville just with great kind of joy while he reminisces about those great days.
Do you ever talk about this? Your own college experience, of course. You were a standout at Stanford and great legendary Jersey high school basketball player, which is no small distinction either. Were you shooting all the time? You were averaging like 24 points a game. And this was, I guess, prior to the advent of the three-point shot. You probably were more mixing up on the inside, were you not, Dan?
So we had a 3-point line in my days in high school, and so I went to my freshman year of high school. I played in New Jersey, and I played my last 3 years in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And that's where I kind of developed and my game really developed. I was a scorer, right? So I could shoot, but I also, played underneath the basket and took it to the hoop. And I kind of had a good nose for scoring the ball. And it's funny you said, was I shooting all the time? My dad was an incredible scorer. To this day, he's the fifth leading scorer in the history of the SEC. Okay, so that gives you a sense of just how prolific he was scoring the basketball. But I shot very high percentages my senior year. So you mentioned I averaged 24 points per game, but I shot like over 60% from 2-point range. And my dad would always tell me, that's because you're not shooting enough, right? If you're shooting that high, shoot more, shoot more. But I was a little bit like risk averse, which probably hurt me later on in my pro career. But I knew how to get to my spots and I knew how to convert. So, yeah, listen, I had a good run, and the game has been a great teacher and joy for me as well throughout my life.
See, no, I would think you talked about how your game developed in Wisconsin, and I've always found this wherever I went around the country. There was something everybody understood fundamentals in New York City and Long Island. If you were playing in a game, even in a half court game or whatever, and you were inbounding a ball and you threw it to the guy on the right, you would go set a pick for the guy that was coming from the left side, and then you go to other places, and the guy doesn't even come around. He just runs to the basket, and you're thinking, what the fuck are you doing? It seemed like that to me. I don't know if you found this, but it seemed like to me, this is not necessarily a New York bias. It was just an observation that kids in New York knew how to play the game, and in other parts of the country that they weren't as well versed in some of the subtleties of the game.
Certainly my dad's era, New York City was the Mecca. It was just the capital. And he says like it was the rhythm of the streets. It was the drumbeat of the community. That's what you did. You played ball. And so, yes, I think, back then there was a distinct advantage, but, I graduated from high school in 2002. And by that point, the game is global, not only national. And so my high school in New Jersey was just a run of the mill suburban high school in Northern New Jersey. But my high school in Milwaukee and the basketball in Milwaukee was far superior. I had NBA players that I played on my AAU team together and, played in my conference in high school. So it was a very, very high level. And, it was my dream to play basketball at Stanford from the time I was in sixth grade, because my grandmother, who we started this story talking about, lives 25 minutes from Stanford's campus. And so we visited when my older sister was looking at colleges, and I was just obsessed, right? And I was a good student. I said, wow, this is an amazing school, and it has a top basketball program. This is where I want to go. And, as I write in my book, that was a long shot for a slow Jewish kid from the suburbs, what I was. But, through a combination of, luck, skill, some timing, it happened. But I don't think it happens if I didn't go to Milwaukee, because there was very, very high level of competition, and it just worked out great for me.
Of course, Pac-10 basketball was a Pac-8 when I lived in California, and dominated by the Wizard and UCLA and the great players that they had there, and yet the other teams were no slouches. Good basketball being played in Washington and Oregon with their two teams, and USC, of course, was always trying to fight to get some kind of an identity there as the redheaded stepchild of the UCLA Bruins, and it was a high caliber of basketball. Now unfortunately, the Pac-10 and Pac-12, right, eventually dissipated down to nothing as a conference. But what was the stature of the conference when you were playing at Stanford, and how did you find that level of basketball?
Yeah, extraordinarily high. It was, one of the top conferences in the country. You mentioned some of the powerhouses, right? You had the Southern California schools, UCLA, USC, Northern California, Stanford, and Cal. Don't forget Arizona, right? Like just an incredible program. Arizona State, Oregon State, Washington. And my sophomore year at Stanford, we were the number one team in the country, right? We started the season 26-0. We were a number one seed in the NCAA tournament, and that's Stanford. So we had been to the Final Four a couple years prior. So we were a juggernaut. But in addition, Leah, you look down your schedule at Oregon, at UCLA, at Washington, at Arizona. It's just a gauntlet, right? And we would come Pac-10, time, we would just be ready, man, because it was nonstop. Every road trip, every home game, it was a grind.
Who were some of your teammates that made that team as good as it was going 26-0?
What's amazing about that team? And by the way, when we're talking about the Pac-10 that year, Arizona, who's our big rival that year, all 5 of their starters played in the NBA.
Wow.
Including Andre Iguodala, who's an all-star Finals MVP.
Sure.
Getting Fry was a lottery pick. Washington had 4 NBA players. Oregon had 2 first-round picks. I think UCLA had 4. They had 4. And so there's just talent abounding throughout the conference. We had 1 NBA player. We had 1, Josh Childress, who was the 6th pick in the draft after that season. Other than that, we just had really good players. Really tough, smart, together. And again, talking about basketball and what can happen, and this kind of can be extrapolated past basketball, right? Like we know in the workplace or other places where things come together, people really interact well, they collaborate well. Sometimes, obviously the sum is greater than the parts, and like that's what happened on that team.
You hear a lot of wild stories about guys that have gone to Europe to play basketball, and you end up having a significant pro career with various European organizations. You begin in Germany, and my image, though, is always when I hear people tell stories about playing in Europe, almost like a scene out of the Blues Brothers, where they had to put up chicken wire between the fans and the people on the court, and haven't been involved in boxing for many years. I've been in situations that could get pretty rough. What was the experience like for you? And was it as harsh a reality as it certainly couldn't have been quite the same as coming out of the locker room at Stanford and running out onto the court?
Right. It wasn't. Listen, like when I was at Stanford and we would go to Oregon and Washington and all these places, they would heckle us pretty good, right?
Yeah,
And they would get on us, but like that's at the college level. Playing professional basketball in Europe, that's a whole different level.
it
And
sounds rough.
I'll caveat it with I'm very lucky that I played in good leagues, really nice, safe countries, established, right? So like I had a really good experience, not only in Germany, but 3 years in Spain, 4 years in Israel. But that being said, like, yeah, it was an adjustment because fans are banging drums and lighting off, smoke bombs during the game. And, and I've had friends who played overseas, like, throwing items that you wouldn't want thrown at you. Yeah, it's a little bit of a different deal over there. There's no doubt, but it's a great experience.
You'd almost rather be the overweight tuba player in the FAMU band when you had to run the gauntlet on that school bus. And fortunately, they put an end to that, unfortunately, because of a catastrophic result. But, from what you see and the stories that people tell, it can be real harsh. So, being a basketball player in Europe, you end up in Israel. That had to be of a special meaning to you.
It was most of my, I mentioned my grandmother, she was one of 10 siblings, 5 survived, 3 went to Israel, 2 to the United States. And so most of my family is in Israel. And I had never been to Israel before 2009 when I had graduated from Stanford in 2006. I was already a pro player playing in Spain. And I played in the Maccabiah Games, which is the Jewish Olympics. And my
Yes.
dad had played in 1973. I got the chance to play the great Bruce Pearl, right, who is now the coach of the #1 ranked Auburn Tigers. Bruce was our coach. And that was my first time in Israel. And my older sister, it was her first time as well. She came to watch. And I remember talking to her, a few days in, and both of us just being like, wow, this is life changing for us, right? To be here. And I told her, like, I'm going to finish my career here. And that's what I did. After my contract in Spain was over, I went to Israel. I played 4 years there, 2 years for the team in Jerusalem, Hopwell Jerusalem, which is a big club in Israel. And, my dad being the only player in NBA history whose parents survived the Holocaust, he played for the New York Knicks and he wore number 18, right? Which is a significant number in Judaism, right? It stands for high to life. And so, he wore number 18 for the New York Knicks. And here I was playing, I was playing with Jerusalem across my chest, right? So for a family that kind of was born from the ashes of the Holocaust, right? That was really
Wow.
significant.
No, that's great. And of course, I believe it was yesterday that was the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the people at Auschwitz. And I saw many, many touching and compelling stories on that as well. And, it had to be, like I said, I mean, just especially deeply meaningful for you to be finishing your career there. All right. Now, your father, Ernie Grunfeld, ends up as a sports executive. And I don't know how much you were hanging around him at the time, but
A lot.
okay. I mean, what was that experience like? Because he seemed like a very easygoing, extremely relatable. Everybody loved Ernie Grunfeld. I mean, whether you were a Knick fan or not, you couldn't help but like the guy. He ended up his career with the Knicks, and I know that it was significant because the Knicks eventually signed you very briefly to a contract, and so a lot of this stuff kind of came full circle. Very interesting way that the story kind of weaved itself around to such meaningful conclusions. But how would you describe, how he felt as an executive? He first was a GM with a couple of teams, Bucks and the Knicks, and Knicks first, I guess, and then became the president of the Washington Wizards.
That's right. Yeah, he had this amazing career as an executive, 30 years as a lead executive. It's one of the most longest tenured lead executives in NBA history. And so, listen, like my dad, yeah, I grew up, he was the general manager of the Knicks. So, whereas my dad would take the subway from Queens and my grandfather would take the subway from the Bronx, and they would buy the cheapest tickets because that's what they could afford. And they would sit in the nosebleeds and watch Dave DeBusschere and Willis Reed and Bill Bradley. And, of course, Red Holzman being the coach of that team. I grew up watching Knick games from a private skybox because my dad was the GM of the team. And by the way, that number 22, Dave DeBusschere, hangs in the rafters of the Garden, but as does number 15 for Dickie McGuire, who you mentioned earlier, who is a dear friend.
Yeah.
But my dad's number 22 hangs in Tennessee, and he wore 22 because of DeBusschere, right? So me growing up with my dad as the general manager of the Knicks was just so cool. And yeah, he has a very good disposition. Like you said, everyone loves Ernie. He's hard to access in that he's always going to be polite. He's always going to be nice, but he keeps to himself a little bit, and he's extraordinarily competitive and hardworking. And so when, listen, like, and you mentioned the untouchable Pat Riley, who's also untouchable in my life. He was a head coach of the Knicks when my dad was a GM. And I grew up listening to Pat and my dad talk basketball at the table. I'd be sitting on the steps. They didn't know I was there. And they would just be talking about the team late at night. I should have been sleeping, right? Like, what kid wouldn't want that childhood, right? So very, very cool experience for me. And I just think for my dad, I mean, really living a dream to come to the United States, like I mentioned, not speaking English, didn't even know basketball, brother passes. Then he finds the game and becomes this great player, has an amazing career at Tennessee, plays in the NBA, finishes his career as a player with the Knicks, but then becomes a broadcaster, then an assistant coach, then front office, and he just rose his way up to the point where he's then running the team. It's truly a Cinderella story. And, I mentioned the great Red Holzman, who's legendary coach of the Knicks. His number is also in the rafters at the Garden, 613, right? Because that's the number of games he won as a coach of the Knicks. My dad watched Red as a kid, and watched DeBusschere as a kid. And then Red was my dad's mentor. And he was like a grandfatherly figure to me. So when you talk about my book and these stories and things coming full circle, sometimes truth is a little bit stranger or more remarkable than even fiction can be. And my family story is one of those examples.
Walt Bells Bellamy and Howard Butch Comives for Dave DeBusschere.
There you go. Right to Detroit.
Dream trade, isn't it? I mean, if you think about what happened there, the significance of that. And of course, Dave DeBusschere, one of those rarities. I guess it was a little more common at the time. He had a guy, Gene Conley, also played with the Celtics and the Red Sox. But DeBusschere was a very, promising pitcher with the White Sox, I think it was, and ended up choosing basketball. And fortunately for us Knick fans at the time, it turned out to be, a very fortuitous thing.
I'll tell you a little Dave DeBusschere baseball trivia, and I heard this from his son because after the book came out, I've connected with a lot of people who touch his story, which is really cool. And of course, Dave DeBusschere was the GM of the Knicks, and he's the one who signed my dad, right? So, and I knew Dave as a kid growing up, and his son told me that, and yeah, like you mentioned, Dave, this amazing all-star in the NBA, incredible player, but he was drafted in the major leagues, a great pitcher. And my understanding is, I could be wrong, but I think this is right, that he was in the draft, he was the pick before Sandy Koufax. So you could research that, but I think they say that's his really biggest distinction in baseball is that a team said, we're going to take Dave DeBusschere, and then the next team said, yeah, we'll take Sandy Koufax.
I might have had a Dave DeBusschere baseball card. I do remember him in a pitching pose. And we didn't realize, to what level he would solidify a great Knicks team. Didn't the Pearl wear 15, though, or Earl of Pearl Monroe?
He did. So in the Garden, 15 is retired twice.
Oh,
so
okay. Wow.
Nick McGuire wore 15, and then Earl of Pearl wore 15, and it's retired. There are two 15s hanging in the Garden. One says McGuire, one says Monroe.
I'm sure I'm not the only guy. I was 16 at the time, but I still remember this, an indelible impression. Trying to dribble the ball on Dick McGuire, which I had no business doing at the time. And I still have an indentation where he elbowed me in the balls.
There- that sounds like Dick. Well, listen,
I mean, he could
hey,
care
you play to
less.
win. New York City, right? You play to win.
Oh
So
my god! Yeah, I mean, I could, as I mentioned that, I feel the pain, Dan. It was unbelievable. Of the experiences he had, Ernie Grunfeld, and of course he's still with us, so we don't want to talk about him in the past tense. But of the experiences he had as an executive, which one? I would imagine the Knicks, of course, was very special. But longtime president of the Wizards, and as I was looking through some of the things that he was involved in, he was involved in some significant transactions,
with
especially in the draft.
without a doubt, right? And he was the GM of the Milwaukee Bucks, and they went to Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals, and he built two teams in Washington that advanced in the playoffs and had a chance. But he was part of two finals teams for the Knicks, and particularly in '94. Lost in Game 7 in Houston, and I was there. I was a 10-year-old. So going, being the general manager of a team that's that close to winning an NBA championship is so significant. But it was that part as well was just an incredible journey. All the ups and the downs, right? Because there's never success without failure, and there's never wins without losses. And so, he learned how to be very gracious and humble when he had great success, and when his teams were struggling, he also learned how to be gracious and humble, right? So I admire and respect that so much about him. And as you said, like, if you know him, which most people don't, because you just read in the paper and you want your team to be better and you want to complain about this trade or that trade without knowing the real context, which is fine because that's kind of how sports is. But for those who know him, they know that about him, that he is just a very honest, straightforward guy with real humility, right? Who wants to win, who will work hard to win, but he carries himself in a way that anyone could be proud of, but certainly his son could be very proud of.
At least on one occasion that I can remember, he had the number one overall pick in the draft, and that was the year John Wall. What was
That's
the
right.
number one overall pick? Did he agonize over this? John Wall was a standout, obviously, as a freshman in college and big time player, and had a very successful pro career. Maybe not as good as, or at the level that people might have anticipated, judging by his stature coming out of college. But how did he approach that? I mean, how much anxiety was there about making a selection like that?
Yeah. For those, John was he was a 5-time NBA All-Star. So, guy had a great career and
Yeah,
uh, really was awesome for the organization in Washington. I think that at that point, my dad had great confidence in the pick, but him and his whole team, the whole staff, they always did their due diligence. They went through their process, right? And again, like I got my MBA and I work in business technology, and I see how really great executives make decisions. And actually, my dad used most of those same decision making processes, and I again, like, that's something I really respect and admire. So while John was pretty much the consensus pick at that time, I know that they did their homework, they had their conversation, so that way when the time came, I don't think there was a doubt to begin, but there certainly wasn't a doubt on draft night. They were ready to go, and it worked out really well for everyone.
It's funny too because when you start reminiscing about some of this stuff and you're thinking about Dave DeBuscher, who you got to know, how familiar were you with some of the other guys on those late '60s, early '70s two-time champion Nick teams? Of course, you had the Pearl, who was one of my
Sure.
favorite players of all time because he could stand on the left side baseline and just square up one shoulder. He had a little bit of an Oscar Robertson shot. And what I love about Earl the Pearl Monroe, and I love this about any athlete that's capable of doing it, you rarely see it. Somebody that can make a complete adjustment in their approach to the game in order to capitulate to the good of the team. And the Pearl was capable. Of course, when he was with the Washington Bullets there and Gene Shue with the crew cut, he's putting up 35 a night as if it was nothing. But he was more of like a scorer in the mid-teens when he was with the New York Knicks, and
Right.
of course paired up with the great Clyde Frazier, Bill Bradley, and Willis
Willis
Reed,
Reed.
all legendary guys. I think Phil Jackson might have been the eighth man, spidery long arm Phil Jackson on that team. Did you get close to many of those guys besides the Busher?
I was lucky to be able to get to know them and be around them. I'm not sure I would say we were close, right? Because there's a lot going on. But when I was growing up, Willis Reed was working with the Nets, so he would often be around, and we would see him at functions. And you know how the Knicks are, like, once a Knick, always a Knick.
That's what it
So
seemed like at that luncheon.
it is that way. And so Bill Bradley, I had the great opportunity to just, be around him on occasions. I have one of, because he, of course, became a senator and presidential candidate and Rhodes Scholar, right, during his time at Princeton. And I have one of his books autographed to me, and it says, "To Dan, from a great friend and admirer of your father, Bill Bradley," right?
Wow.
And if you take a step back and think about that, he's saying that about a guy who, like we just said, came to the United States as an immigrant, didn't speak the language, found basketball, and it really carved a path for him. So, that in and of itself just like speaks to the power of the game. But of course, Walt Clyde being the voice of the Knicks, and actually, Walt Frazier has been an announcer for so many years, but he replaced my dad many, many years ago, because my dad, after his career, did radio for a few years, and I believe once he transitioned to being assistant coach, Walt Clyde came in and started broadcasting, and the rest is history. He's just a legend, but was able to kind of be around him because of that. So, listen, like I said, like, amazing way to grow up, but once you're part of that Knicks organization, you're always kind of part of that family in some way.
Dan Grunfeld, our special guest here on Conversations this week. Great stuff. Very inspiring. Couple of things I noticed in looking over your ledger, your resume there, Wikipedia, that you took an interest in business while you were at Stanford. Actually, it turned out to be very fortunate, because you ended up being a very successful business guy out there in the Silicon Valley.
Yeah, my parent and my grandmother always stressed to me the importance of academics. My grandmother is a brilliant person. She loved to learn, and she wasn't able to get a formal education because of the Holocaust, right? And so I had an opportunity to be here in the United States to learn, to go to school. It always really mattered to me to make the most of it. And so, having gone to Stanford as an undergrad, I did very well there academically. Once I retired from my professional career, I knew I wanted to go back to school, and so actually my last year playing ball, I probably worked harder studying for my GMAT, and it showed. I did well on the test. My production on the court was lacking just a bit, but listen, like that's always been really an important value to me. And so, I wanted to pursue that kind of with the same vigor and with the same intensity that I did basketball. And so, I was able to get my MBA and transition to more of a business role and have a nice trajectory there. But certainly the game is never far, from my orbit and from my consciousness. So still one of my great loves.
Are you still hoisting them?
If I'm in the position,
you're too young to have given up the game, Dan. Come on.
I'm not playing. No one wants to see that. And I certainly, I don't want to get hurt. I have 2 young kids running around, so they keep me busy enough. But if I'm in a gym and there's a ball around, which happens sometimes, I'll spend a half hour just getting them up, because you don't forget how to do it, but you also don't forget what it feels like and the joy from it. That's like when I was a little kid just shooting around, and so if I get the opportunity to do it, I still try to.
All right. I know you do some political commentary, and we couldn't leave the show or this interview without your thoughts about what's going on in Israel right now.
Listen, I'll always be a big, great supporter of Israel, right? Israel was founded to protect and preserve the Jewish people after the Holocaust, right? My family included, and it exists today for the same purpose, right? Because the history of the Jewish people has been, unfortunately, one of persecution and of so many things happening. So it's so important to have a safe place, right, for Jews around the world. And that's what Israel is. And of course, there are so many different parts to the story and so many different histories. And no one would say that Israel has done everything right in its history, but Israel is a democracy where they value freedom, they value respect. And so, it's a place that I care about deeply. And then I'm always, there just hoping for safety and security for those people.
And just as a final thought, I mean, obviously a wonderful relationship with your father, and I want to recommend to everybody, and I've got to go out and get a copy of this book myself, By the Grace of the Game, by Dan Grunfeld. I mean, great story. And as I said at that luncheon, it was very riveting and compelling to even just be sitting there saying, what do I got to do next? And you really took the stage and captured the people's imagination with the story. So much of which you've described in the book. You could do a brief characterization of what it was like, A, to be the son of Ernie Grunfeld, and B, to have him as a father.
So I'm going to start with B first. My dad's an amazing father. But then that's the most important part, right? He loves me, my sister. We're his priority. So you have this public persona, and you're an athlete, and then you're a GM, and you're on the front page of the New York Post because you're great, and then you're on the front page of the New York Post because you're terrible, right? Like that's how it is when you're a team executive. But
Yeah.
that's the external part. But we're human beings, right? There's a family, there's a home, there are rituals and routines, and just father and son, father and daughter. And he always put us first, and he always just led with love with us, right? So and I've learned so much from him as a father, that now I'm a father, right? And I do the same thing with my kids, or at least try to. But so that's the most important thing, that he's just really an amazing father. And then the other part of it is growing up in kind of that environment where, like, cool,
Yeah.
like my dad's the GM of the Knicks, so I get to go to the All-Star games, and I'm at the playoff games, and yeah, I come home and Pat Riley's there, or Patrick Ewing's there, and or Bernard King, and that's just like really cool. It also was a really special bond, even to this day. My dad, and I'll tell you, you'll appreciate this. My dad called me today and said, "Hey, man, I was going to send you this video about Tiny Archibald, but then I know you had a lot going on, so I didn't send it yet." I said, "Well, Dad, send it." So even to this day, right? Like, we're still kind of living this life, and really appreciating the game. Listen, there's also a bit of a cost to it, because there's a lot of pressure, and kids can be cruel. And I'm very honest about this in the book, that people always looked at me, especially as a ball player. "Oh, he's Ernie's kid. Oh, of
Yeah.
course he starts on that team. He's Ernie's kid. Oh, they run all the play for him. Yeah, he scores 20 a game. He's Ernie's kid," right? So that really, I didn't like it, but it put a chip on my shoulder, and I think it motivated me in a lot of ways. And the one value from my dad and from his parents, is work, right? Just work, outwork people, and good things will happen. And that's what I always tried to do. So listen, like, I wouldn't trade my upbringing, my childhood, certainly my relationship with my dad. He's an amazing guy.
Dan, can't thank you enough. I mean, very inspiring when I got to experience your story for the first time back there in mid-December at the basketball luncheon. And can't thank you enough for coming on the show and sharing some of these ideas and some of your thoughts and experiences with us here on Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us here on the program.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you very much. Dan Grunfeld, ladies and gentlemen. Pleasure having him on the show. And we're going to make a little transition here. We have to welcome a new gentleman as part of the Bleacher Brothers fraternity. I mean, it's great. And I've said this forever. I've been doing broadcasting here in South Florida for it's almost 44 years now. And it never ceased to amaze me with all the people. I was out at the park last night, Pompano Municipal Tennis Center, where many years ago I saw a 14-year-old Naomi Osaka. And I remember asking the pro there, Eddie Sposa, I'm saying, "Who the hell is that girl, man? She looks like she's pretty good." And he said, "That's Naomi Osaka. She's going to be all right. She's ranked like 250 in the world already." And of course, she went on to tremendous heights, and didn't necessarily complete what was expected of her, or what seemed to be on the table for her, because she had various things going on in her life. Is back in action right now, but it always surprised me that with all of the attention, and the courts were packed last night, couldn't even get on there when we wanted to. That was paid to tennis here, and all the participants. It was rarely discussed in any form of media. I mean, you'd see the interviews with some of the superstars that live here, and occasionally when they won a tournament, but you couldn't really bring it up as a sports talk topic. But without people, you could actually hear the thud as people were punching the radio off and turning off the channels. And it always amazed me, because tennis is so popular here, and you can play it year round. We welcome to the show, and we welcome the Bleacher Brothers.
Thank you.
This is exciting. Matt Pressman, who has Florida Tennis Magazine, and has been the owner of this publication, outstanding publication, goes back to 1991 for many, many years. Matt, welcome to the show. Thanks so much. We wanted to introduce you to our Bleacher Brothers audience here today.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. It's a pleasure. It's cool to hear you're a player. I got to hear more about that. I guess you still hit the ball at least once a week or so, or?
Well, I try. I mean, it's hard to find opponents that you can beat at this stage of my life. So I have a guy I've been playing like 20 years, but his game has deteriorated so badly, Matt, that it's kind of sad, actually. I don't know how you handle that when you're playing a friend, and his game has just fallen off a cliff, and you're scoring on shots. I mean, these are lollipops I'm serving up there, and he's hitting them into the bottom of the net. But any guy. I mean, it's true, right? You found this to be true.
Yeah.
If a guy has real tennis form, he's going to beat the snot out of somebody like me that just manufactured a game.
Now, did you play high school tennis or did you
No,
play?
no, tennis.
No.
It's funny. It was kind of taboo. I grew up in New York. We were just talking with Dan Grunfeld about that, and basketball was
Yeah.
a game of choice, and tennis. You felt sorry for the guy that was playing tennis because it was something that you only played when your girlfriend demanded that you spend some time with her. So all the other guys were playing basketball and having a blast, and we'd look over and see like, oh, there's poor Bob over there. He's hitting tennis balls, and that was in the day of the wooden racket. And the game has
Yeah.
advanced dramatically since then. One of the things that I remember though left an indelible impression was reading an article in Sports Illustrated, and there were some quotes from John McEnroe, and McEnroe was beefing that tennis players, for some reason, weren't really considered athletes. And
Yeah.
when you watch the game today, my God, you talk about evolution, man.
Crazy athletes. Yeah, I'll tell you. Well, I was in New York City for about 20 years, and I played some street basketball. I actually played basketball growing up and tennis, so I had those two sports, and I feel like they complement each other really well, basketball and tennis. But it was so much easier playing pickup basketball in New York City than it was playing tennis. I had to play under the FDR Bridge,
Yeah, yeah.
wait for
Mini
court
court.
for like an hour,
Yeah.
pay almost $200 to get on a court at Central Park. So New York wasn't really cut out for tennis players. At least the city wasn't. I mean, obviously where McEnroe came from, it's out in Long Island. He trained with Harry Hopman. It was a different thing. But yeah, I mean, I think tennis players get a bad rap in terms of being good athletes, but I find most of the time at a higher level, at a serious junior player level or college tennis level, most of the guys have played baseball or basketball or played some other sport growing up. So yeah, I agree. It's a weird thing with tennis, like that it doesn't get the right rap that it deserves in terms of athletics. Yeah.
Well, would you say this is the tennis capital of at least the United States? Because I mean, going back, you had the Bolletary Academy, of course, now IMG,
Yeah.
and the players they developed there. It was remarkable. If you watch any kind of history or documentary about Nick Bolletary or the academy that he started, but it's going on all over the place. I mean, as I mentioned, my buddy and I used to go out there. A couple of fat guys were going out there playing tennis at the Pompano Municipal Tennis Center, which wasn't necessarily a learning ground for top pro players. There's Osaka out there
Yeah.
hitting balls. I mean, Simonova is from here. Plantation, I guess, Florida has developed a lot of pros. You had the Chris Everett. Or her father's academy. She has something
Sure.
going now in Boca Raton.
Sure.
Is this the hottest place for a tennis player to come?
It's
If
the
they want
crown jewel of American tennis is what I call it, Florida. I mean, I was fortunate in that I went down to Saddlebrook Resort, which is in Tampa. So that was called the Harry Hopman Tennis Academy. Harry Hopman was once McEnroe's coach, had a academy in Port Washington, New York as well. So there's a connection there, an Australian. And at that time, you had Andy Roddick going there, Marty Fish, you had Pete Sampras, Jennifer Capriati, and the big competitor was Bolletary, right? So that when the Hopmans guys played the Bolletary guys, that was like the ultimate competition at a junior level, which is when I was playing more seriously, let's say. Nowadays, I was just looking at the top 10 for both women and men. Right now, there's 4 American players in the top 10, right? You've got Emma Navarro, you've got Madison Keys, obviously with the huge win in Australia, Jessica Pegula and Coco Gauff. 3 of the 4 are from Florida. So it gets even crazier with the men. So there's only 2 male players who are American in the top 10. Tommy Paul and Taylor Fritz both have residences in Florida, which is crazy. So you've got so many players who are big-time American players from Florida, or at least came through Florida at some point, either in the juniors or at the academies, that it's the place for tennis by far.
Yeah, I mean, there were other academies, and a man's name escapes me. He actually had Serena there for a little while, and a couple of other.
Rick Macy. Rick
Rick
Macy.
Macy,
Yeah, he's here in Boca Raton. Yeah, and he's right near Chris Everett Academy. Yeah.
I think he might have
Yeah.
given me a lesson one time when I was doing some kind of radio promotion, and naturally, he immediately sized up the situation and decided to move on. But no, and it's absolutely great. I wanted to talk about this Madison Keys story because it's a very touching story. Also, this is a woman that never won a slam before. I mean, obviously, the last two rounds, she mows down Swiatek, who maybe
Yeah,
hasn't been quite as invincible as she was a year or so ago when she rattled off like 30 some odd consecutive match victories. And then Sabalenka, who had
yeah.
destroyed Paula Badosa in the previous round and was playing at the top of her game, going for the three-peat at the Australian. But even the players she met in the earlier rounds, I mean, this was one of the more remarkable runs to a championship we've seen maybe in any sport.
Yeah, it's been an incredible run for Madison Keys, and I think I have a theory on this, like an interesting theory. I think, there's actually two Americans, both who have lived here in Florida. One is Madison Keys, who just ran through an incredible tournament, the Australian Open. Another one is Danielle Collins, right,
Yeah.
who's from St. Pete, who won the Miami Open and then won the Charleston Open right after that. Both kind of edging around 30 years old at the time, sort of already kind of past their prime. Everybody writes them off. And these two American players, within almost a year of each other, have just come out of nowhere to do incredible things. And I think what it speaks to for both of these players, and I'll get to Madison in a sec, is that as a tennis player, and because you play yourself, when you put pressure on yourself, you tend to get tight, play so well. I think both of these players are playing loose. They're relaxed. No one expects a thing of either of them. And all of a sudden, Madison Keys, who everyone sort of wrote off. I mean, she hits a huge ball. She's a great player, but her winning a major at this point, no one would have guessed it.
Very
And
improbable.
I think just like Danielle Collins did in Miami Open here in Florida last year, she just came out of nowhere because no one expects it, and there's no pressure. So pretty amazing.
Collins had fared very well in several big tournaments, although she was getting a raspberry from the crowd
Oh yeah,
in Australia. I guess she was playing an Australian girl who I hadn't heard of before, and they were really getting on her. And then she more or less, flashed the crowd, some kind of, ugly
yeah,
gesture, and and completely different dispositions and compositions, but both
yeah.
to their game and to their personalities, Collins and Madison Keys.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny to watch Collins because I was really rooting for her, thinking if there's anybody from America that comes out of nowhere, it's Danielle Collins, not
Yeah,
Madison Keys. And I even thought that because she's such a firecracker and she's so fiery on the court, and she got up in the fans' kind of face with her whole, not just the gesture, but afterwards
like
in
kiss
the
my
press
ass,
conference.
basically, was what you were saying. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So it's pretty wild to see the whole thing. But yeah, I think. Look, man, I think Danielle Collins still has a lot left. She was supposed to retire at the end of last year, and she's
yes.
back in it this year. And I think she's someone to take a look at. Look, we've got a really big tournament coming up here in Florida, the Miami Open. She could defend her title coming up, soon. What's going to happen? Will Madison Keys be there? Will she be a threat? Coco Gauff is also from Delray Beach. Jessica Pegula is from Boca Raton. Arena Sabalenka has a place in Miami. So you think about it across the board, there's so many players from Florida that could take the crown here in Florida in the Miami Open. And so I just think that the Australian was interesting to watch. And it was so cool seeing Madison run through the tournament like that. And I think it's going to be fun to watch women's tennis this year and just see who really rises to the top. I thought it would be Coco last year. It just
She
didn't work
started out
out.
great this year. She won like something like 18 matches out of 19 or something at the beginning of the
Yeah,
season.
I think Brad Gilbert sort of left the camp, and
Yeah.
and that was
I'm a
I
big
think.
Gilbert fan. I don't know how you feel about him, but I always liked Brad Gilbert.
Me too, huge fan. I read the book Winning Ugly, and I've always loved his game. He got to four in the world. Someone who really made the most of his own talent. I mean, which was good, but nothing near number four in the world.
No,
So I thought what he did with Agassi was incredible, and I think what he was doing with Coco Gauff was great. It remains to be seen whether Coco will sort of go places this year. But she's such a great player. She's three in the world right now, and I think she's of all the Americans in Florida, and there are quite a few of them right now. Like I was saying, she's somebody I would keep an eye out for sure.
all right, we have to run. It's been a pleasure. We welcome you and looking forward to some tennis conversation here
Thank you
on
so much. Looking forward to it.
Pressman, Florida Tennis Magazine. Thank you, my friend. Thanks for joining us and welcome aboard.
You got it. Thanks so much, man. Great to be here.
All right, a lot of fun today being with you guys. Dan Grunfeld, extremely interesting story. Matt Pressman, Florida Tennis Magazine, comes on board here with the Bleacher Brothers. That's going to do it for this week's edition of Conversations. I'm Jeff DeForest. We will catch you next week. Should have a good time. Mike Westhoff, a longtime coach in the National Football League, going to join us, and one of the more astute football analysts. Will be very appropriate. We've tried to have a little moratorium here before we got to the week before the Super Bowl. But if you were going to dissect the game and or the NFL, nobody better. He has a book out about his many NFL experiences called Figure It Out, which you can buy online. And he'll be joining us next week on the next edition of Conversations. For Dan Grunfeld, Matt Pressman, and Toby, our producer, I'm Jeff DeForest. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time on next week's edition of Conversations with Jeff DeForest.